Welcome back to Economics. This is Dr. Kling, and today's topic is price controls and quantity controls. So this is where the government comes in and does something to distort the market, and we see how what happens with that. So let's take an example of a price control. So let's say we're talking about apartments in New York City. And it's well known that there's rent control, so the price in this case is rent for apartments and quantity is number of apartments, and we're sort of representing this as if there were just sort of a one price fits all or one rent fits all, which is really not the way the rent controls work there. It's sort of each individual apartment is rent controlled differently, but the result is pretty much the same, as we will show on this. So, for a price control, so that means that they cannot charge a rent above a certain amount. Now, if we had a rent ceiling that was up here somewhere, then it really wouldn't matter because the market equilibrium rent would be below would be below the ceiling. So a price ceiling is only binding if it's below what would be the market equilibrium. So you have to have for a price ceiling to be binding, it would have to be something like this. So this is a binding price ceiling. Okay, so that becomes the price, because the price is not allowed to go above that, even though the equilibrium wants to be higher. And so now what do we do? So what do we do with quantity? Well, the notion is that you cannot force anybody to supply or demand more than they want to. So what that means is, in this case, the limiting amount will be the amount supplied here. So even though apartment renters would love to have more apartments at this below market rent rate, they're not going to get them because the supply is restricted. Okay, so now let me put a bunch of points on this. Let me call this A, B, C, D, E, F. Okay, well, let's see if we can keep track of things. Okay, what I want to show is if there were no, so the first case would be if there were no controls versus with the price control or the rent control. Okay, so the equilibrium point, so the equilibrium is with no controls would be at point C. With controls, it's at point D. So the equilibrium is at point D. In terms of surplus, the consumer surplus with no controls would be, I think I'm going to need another point here. Let's call that G, would be ACG. Okay. With controls, they get A, B, D, E. That is, they get all the surplus that's here. The producer's surplus would have been GCF, but it is now reduced to EDF. And what's interesting is if you look at this triangle BCD, that becomes orphaned with the with the price controls. So let me leave the graph up there, sorry. So BCD is lost, and economists will call that a deadweight loss. So we don't know whether this, we know for sure that the producer's surplus has gone down, because that triangle is definitely smaller. So the producer's surplus has gone down. Producer's surplus has gone down. Now, for the apartment renters, the people, the buyers in the market, their surplus may or may not have gone down. It's a different shape, and it conceivably went up. But the total surplus we know went down by this BCD triangle here. BCD. So there's that, and that's the deadweight loss. We know that that overall the economy could have been better off without those controls, if we didn't have those price ceilings. Now, of course, the price controls redistribute, as we said. It hurts producers definitely, but it may the consumers who are lucky enough to get the apartments may be better off. Okay, so that's a price ceiling. Let's just do a price floor, and I won't do the entire analysis with all those points, but an example would be something like in agriculture. Let's say this is the milk market, so the quantity of milk and the price of milk, and it wants to be here at the points QE and PE. But the government, in its wisdom, says, we don't really like that price. Farmers are unhappy, milk farmers are unhappy. Let's set a minimum price for milk here. So this is the price floor. And again, if they set a price floor that was way down here, it wouldn't matter because the market would be putting a price above it. But when the price floor is above where the market is, then it's a binding price floor. And now the first quantity that we hit is the demand curve. And so nobody wants to buy milk any more milk at this high price, so we don't get the rest of the demand curve. We just stop here. So this is the amount of milk that's demanded here, and then this is the amount that the milk producers want to supply. And so the government has to do something about that supply. One possibility is the government will buy that milk and store it or give it away in foreign countries or just destroy it. So the government could buy it up. Another option, with some crops, the government will actually pay farmers not to grow crops, and so they'll be paid to leave their land fallow, and that'll cut the supply back to here. But otherwise, there'll be this excess supply that the government has to buy up and dispose of. So once again, there will be a loss of surplus because instead of going to here, we're here, and so I'll put these points. This triangle ABC will be the total loss of surplus. The producers, though, may or may not be getting more surplus. The consumers are definitely losing consumer surplus. So that's a price floor. Now I said there could also be quantity controls. If you're often the goal of the price floor is to raise the income of producers. Another way to raise income of producers is to restrict quantity. So for example, in a taxi cab market, the government the local government may limit the number of taxis allowed so that the demand for taxi rides has to be you don't end up at the equilibrium price for taxi rides because the government fixes the number of medallions. They're called taxi medallions. You have to own a government license, a medallion, in order to run a taxi. And so the way that works is that fixes the supply, the quantity, and once again you'll see this triangle of consumer surplus that disappears. What we think happens is that the cost of the medallion, the cost of obtaining a medallion gets built into the supply curve. So in effect the supply curve shifts back. But if this is point A, B, C, we have another triangle here of lost surplus from having the medallions, and definitely a loss of consumer surplus, possibly, and it's pretty hard to tell what happens to producer surplus. So that's the effect of a quantity restriction. And interestingly enough, you can see from the graphs that you can produce the same result from a price restriction or a quantity restriction. And we'll maybe talk about that more, or we'll talk about tariffs versus quotas. But the main takeaway is that when the government distorts a market with price controls or with quantity controls, there's a net loss of total surplus. One side will definitely lose if it's something that favors the consumers who are able to get the good. Then the producers definitely lose. If it's something that favors the producers who are able to supply the good, then the consumers definitely lose. But overall, somebody loses that little triangle in the middle every time. So I think that's it for consumer surplus, producer surplus, and price controls and quantity controls.